On your handout that you have in front of you, it's called Chapter 25, the Berlin Conference. And what we're going to do in this chapter, we're going to talk a couple of things of how Europeans wanted to expand their influence and control into Africa. Sometimes this is called the Scramble for Africa. And we've talked about Europeans' interest in Africa before, but Europeans have not really been able to do a whole lot in Africa, partly because of disease. We've talked about that before as a factor. And also because they've been interested elsewhere. They've been interested in the Americas, they've been interested in trade with India. But now, at the end of the 1800s, with advances in medicines that's going to make diseases like malaria less of a factor, we're going to see all of these countries wanting a little piece of Africa, even countries that we haven't really seen as powerful or important in the past. This political cartoon shows you countries like Italy, countries like Belgium, and countries like Germany, which we haven't really talked about having major overseas empires getting involved in this scramble for Africa really for the first time. Eventually, if you take a look at this map, 1880, this is just a map of like what Africa looked like as far as like foreign powers coming in and setting up to control. Really, there's not a lot. Algeria has been taken over by the French in the north. The Ottoman Empire controls, a good amount of land and territory in North Africa. But really what we have is local indigenous African kingdoms. We don't have a whole lot of Europeans, and if we do, they're really mainly hugging the coast where they're safe. That's going to change, though. Forward, we're going to see that this man, King Leopold II, he's going to be the one who's really going to get colonization started. And so we have on the handout that there's this leader, Otto von Bismarck, and he is going to be the one who calls, we'll write down the Berlin Conference. Now, the person on this slide is King Leopold II, and we're going to see in a little bit how he really causes huge benefits to, he benefits greatly from this Berlin Conference. But it says on the handout, Otto von Bismarck called the Berlin Conference, and at this conference, major European powers agreed to divide Africa among themselves. They wanted to make sure they could split up Africa in ways that they thought were fair or equitable. It says that this would replace the previous relationships based on trade. Europeans originally kind of just stayed on the coast of Africa. They weren't really able to get into deep interior of Africa, but all that changed with advances in medicine, and now they're conquering instead of just trading. And this really had a first come, first serve view of colonization. That countries that gained most of Africa, well, the French and the British, and that shouldn't be a big surprise because they're the most powerful countries at the time. So the two most common foreign European languages spoken in Africa today are English and French, because they controlled huge parts of Africa. There's other countries like King Leopold here, we'll talk about him just a little bit, who represents Belgium, but they don't really do most of the conquering. They don't really do take over most of Africa compared to these other places, these other countries. It says any land not being farmed was considered vacant and available. And so when white Europeans like King Leopold II looked at African use of the land, what they saw was, well, it doesn't seem like there's really anything going on. It doesn't seem like they're really using the land. If they're not using the land, they definitely must be open to us taking the land, because these native Africans are not really using the land. We Europeans will go ahead and do what they refuse to do. This is the same attitude white settlers sometimes had towards the Native Americans when they looked at the land that the Native Americans had in the Americas, and they didn't seem to be making use of it the way the Europeans would, so they assumed it was available and they just took it. And so it says the Scramble for Africa winners, the big winners were Britain and France, and the losers, well, go ahead and look at the map on the PowerPoint or in the book to tell me 3 countries that were Europeans that did not conquer a lot of territory, ones that were kind of left out. One person that we'll focus in now as a good example of the exploiting of Africa is King Leopold II. Now, he's a really good on the natural resources that they thought they could get from Belgium. It turns out that the Congo has a lot of rubber. This at this time came from trees, like the tree here that we have, and by tapping the rubber tree, that it would come out and they could use this. And this was a big deal because, as you remember, Europe has just gone through the Industrial Revolution, and things like rubber and materials of this sort are very, very useful. So King Leopold II of Belgium helped to begin the scramble for Africa, and he was rewarded by taking Congo as his personal possession. And the thing that he wanted the most was to force Africans to harvest rubber. Here we have tapping rubber vines. That these are vines that if you would cut a hole in them, the sap would go out in these little pots to collect, and Europeans would have this sent on over to Europe. The problem with this is that there were certain numbers and requirements and quotas that the Europeans placed on the local African workers that were unrealistic. And because they were unrealistic, they were not able to meet those quotas. And so what happened was that these Africans in the Congo were often killed in order to make the quotas. They were often subject to physical abuse and even the chopping off of their hands. In order to enforce this, Europeans began to train and to equip local African soldiers so that they could be the people on the front line to arrest or to punish other Africans in the Congo. And sometimes they would use different tribes, and they would pick one tribe of people in the Congo, and they would make them into soldiers and give them the responsibility of disciplining and sometimes even torturing other tribes in the Congo for not delivering enough rubber. It says here there's one description of how the white colonials dealt with Africans. Here it describes what it was like to work under white colonial rule in the Congo. It says, all blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier, who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw this soldier then guarding the village take a net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach big stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber causes these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or rape their own mothers and sisters. And so all of this happened just because of the European desire to get a hold of this natural resource. Here you can see the result of this policy was that if they couldn't get the certain amount of rubber, white Europeans required that to pay the Europeans, or to show that they were enforcing the quotas, they chopped off the hands of the workers who did not produce the amount of rubber required for Belgium. And this way they hoped to spread fear throughout the African population of the Congo, the Belgian Congo, to make sure that they would work harder so that Belgium would make the money that they desired off of rubber. Here another description, it says, the baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of the European post commanders became the symbol of the Congo Free State. The collection of hands became an end in itself. Force publique soldiers, here force publique are those African soldiers that were trained to represent white colonials in the Congo. They were the ones who would enforce these rules, but whites would also do the chopping off of hands as well. This chopped off hands became a sort of currency. They came to be used to make up for all shortfalls and rubber quotas. To replace the people were demanded for the forced labor gangs, and the force publique soldiers were paid their bonuses on the basis of how many hands they collected. So the white Belgian officials told them, If you want bonuses, if you want to get paid, you'll show us you're enforcing the law by chopping off hands. And so, with this kind of treatment, with this type of punishment, and with diseases where it says the death toll, we think that anywhere between 3 to 10 million people were killed in the Congo. 3 to 10 million is hard. These numbers are not certain, but certainly the lowest number is 3 million, the highest is 10 million. When you recall that the Holocaust of the Jews, which was terrible, was 6 million, and everyone knows about that, everyone studied that, this could very well be 10 million, but probably most people don't know anything about King Leopold II, even though he probably ranks, based on this policy, as one of the most evil rulers of human history, causing the death of 3 to 10 million people, which is one of the most saddest chapters of African history here in the Congo. You can see the winners and losers here. France does really well because of the Berlin Conference. They take everything in green. Everything in red ultimately will be the British, or I guess it's like an orange color here. There's some new countries that we haven't seen before. Belgium, I mentioned to you as well. Italy is in there. Germany is in there. But also take note that on the very bottom there's two countries which are independent, two countries that never get their independence lost, and that would be Liberia, and that would also be modern-day Ethiopia. And so let's go ahead and talk about two exceptions to this. Europeans conquering and taking over. We'll look down where it says modernization in Egypt and Ethiopia. So you might remember that the Ottoman Empire controlled a huge part of North Africa, but little by little, North Africa had gained its independence. Here, the map says that all the purple of North Africa gained their freedom between 1878 and 1914, and that included Egypt. And we've already talked about this before, but there was something that happened to Egypt that really made them have a wake-up call and think about the need to modernize. We talked about in the past that Napoleon had, before he fully took over France, was sent to Egypt. He wanted to conquer the Middle East, and he wanted to take over, and he did go. It says on your handout that the role of Napoleon, there was a French presence until 1801. Napoleon had taken over with relative, we'll write down the word ease. He'd taken over with relative ease, and this, we'll write down, had shocked the Egyptian people that a European power was capable of such a quick invasion. This was something that they were not prepared for, something they did not think would happen, and so definitely the Egyptians were really wanting to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. How could Europeans, which had been considered backwards for so long, just swoop into Egypt and take over so quickly? And there's a guy that you should know by name who was responsible for starting the modernization of Egypt. It's this guy right here. His name is Muhammad Ali, and his dates are 1769 to 1849, and he was the ruler who took over upon the departure of the French, and his goal was modernization. He wanted to modernize Egypt. He wanted to make sure that Egypt would never ever fall to European forces again. It says that military reforms, he had wanted to have a Western-style army to prevent Egypt from ever being conquered again. And there's a couple things that he wanted to do as he wanted to modernize Egypt. One of the things he did is, for sure, it says military reforms. He wanted to have a modern navy. He wanted to have a modern army. He wanted his soldiers to dress and look like Europeans. But there's other things apart from military. That is literature. It says literature began to be printed, especially Islamic literature. Especially Islamic literature. The printing press came late to Egypt, but with Muhammad Ali, he wanted to make sure that more and more printing would be done, more and more literature would be printed, the Quran, religious books, all that would increase. And also what would increase? Trade with Europe. It says trade with Europe went up 600%. 600%. Well, after Muhammad Ali was another leader named Ismail, and he continued, we'll write down, westernization. He wanted to westernize his country. In fact, he westernized his country in his mind so much that he once said, "My country is no longer in Africa, it is in Europe." It is in Europe. That was the kind of progress that he wanted to see, was that his people were using books, his people had a modern army, his people were really becoming more and more modern. He said, "My country is now in Europe." Now, the bummer about modernization is that he had to borrow money to make that happen, and we'll write down he grew in debt to the Europeans. He grew in debt to the Europeans. Now, what were some of the things that were paid for the modernization of Egypt? Well, it would be this: cotton. It says cotton exports doubled in the 1860s, and the big thing that happened in the 1860s was, well, the Civil War. And because the Civil War was happening, they were able to make a lot of money as a result. And so it says their cotton export was up. We'll write down 30 times. They were doing 30 times the amount of cotton that they had previously. So that had made them a lot of money. But the bummer is, of course, we'll see that the Civil War doesn't last forever, and the high prices of southern cotton not making it to the market, well, that is going to change. What do they do with some of their money? Well, part of their money is they decide to build the Suez Canal. It says infrastructure on your handout. We'll write down they built 800 miles of rail and the Suez Canal. The reason why they wanted the Suez Canal was, well, just take a look. You know, if you are wanting to get to India, if you are wanting to get to Asia, the Suez Canal, in showing you the route in red, allows you to cut through the Mediterranean, go through Egypt, cut through the Red Sea, and get to India, instead of having to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa. So this is something that they do build that's really good. They don't actually have the know-how to do it on their own, and so they have British, we'll write down engineers, British engineers. They would also help build something called the Aswan Dam, and so they decide to dam the Nile River. I mean, the Nile River is this huge river, and they decide that they could do what Europeans do with their rivers, and to dam up the Nile. And they use British engineers who have that know-how to come in and do that. American influence, well, the Civil War ends, and guess what happens to those high cotton prices? Cotton prices drop, revenue decreased. Revenue means like how much money are we making? And if you're used to making like a whole bunch of money, and then all of a sudden, the thing that you made a lot of money goes away, you know, those high prices of cotton, because the American South wasn't able to bring it to the market, the revenue dropped. And Europeans, well, they had lent a lot of money to Egypt, and Egypt was just borrowing, thinking, oh, we'll be fine, there's no really need to worry about it. But now, they don't have the money to pay off those debts. So it says that European intervention to ensure repayment. European intervention to ensure repayment. So basically, the British in particular invaded Egypt and said, we're just going to invade and just make sure that you can repay your debts. This should sound really familiar because this is the exact same thing that happened in China. This is the same thing that happened in the Ottoman Empire, where countries either borrowed or were in debt or owed money to white European countries they couldn't pay back, and white European countries invaded to make sure that that would happen. The British invaded in 1882. They invaded in 1882 to guarantee repayment, and they would stay for 70 years. 70 years they would rule Egypt. And the British ruled Egypt, we'll write down indirectly. They claimed that Egypt was independent, but really the people that were kind of dictating and running the show were the British. Well, second example we'll talk about is Ethiopia. So Egypt is kind of like semi-independent. They try to modernize, they try to westernize, Well, Ethiopia is truly independent. The only other country that was independent in Africa was Liberia. You might remember Liberia was started by the United States. We actually sent a lot of freed slaves back to Africa under President Monroe, and they started the country called Liberia. And the only reason Liberia doesn't get taken over by other countries is because like we kind of started and we kind of offer our protection to Liberia. But the only other country truly independent is Ethiopia, a country that we've talked about before. You might remember that religiously, Ethiopia was Christian for 1,500 years. Christianity was a huge part of Ethiopian culture. They didn't become Christian because of white missionaries. They didn't become Christian because of outside Europeans coming in. They were Christian a long time before even some parts of Europe were. So they had been Christian for some 1,500 years. And one of the things that Italy realized is, one of the things that Ethiopia realized was that Europeans are conquering the planet. They're beating up Africans, they're taking over the Americas, they're taking over China, and there's one thing that we really need to do if we want to avoid being conquered and being taken over. And that is buying modern European weapons. It says on the head-up that European modern guns were purchased from Europe. They begin to buy rifles. They begin to buy weapons. And so later on, they're going to actually use European guns. Here you can see the Ethiopian army on the left, and they're fighting an invading European army on the right. The country on the right is actually Italy, and you can see this is an Ethiopian depiction of what this battle looked like, but they're going to use European guns to protect and defend themselves. In fact, when Emperor encouraged actually the production of firearms at home, he said, we'll buy guns from the white Europeans, but let's also learn to make our own. Also, Ethiopian leader Menelik II, he even defended his country from invasion from Italy. Italy wanted a little piece of Africa. They thought, oh, well, what part of Africa is not taken over? Ethiopia's not taken over. Let's go ahead and invade. And so here you see in this painting, white Italians flood into Ethiopia thinking this should be easy. Black armies are backwards. They're not really prepared or equipped for battle. And this most famous battle is the Battle of Dawa. In this Battle of Dawa, the Ethiopians had 80,000 men armed with rifles. 20,000 of them didn't have rifles, they just had spears and swords, and shockingly, the Ethiopians won. This was one of the rare examples of a modern European army being defeated by an African army. This was super embarrassing for the Italians. All the other Europeans, whenever they brought the Maxim gun, whenever they brought cannons, whenever they brought machine guns, they usually destroyed China or destroyed the Egyptians or destroyed any other African kingdoms. But when the Italians come, and the Italians bring cannons and they bring machine guns, but they don't get a victory because the Ethiopians bought and learned to use the very same technology. This was humiliating for the Italians and encouraging for the Ethiopians. What kind of consequences are there for that Battle of Dawa? Well, two. For Africa, there was the rise of African nationalism and Pan-Africanism. This means an increase in pride of being African and the desire that we as Africans can resist European colonization. One scholar says that after Dawa, Ethiopia became emblematic of African valor and resistance, the bastion of prestige and hope to thousands of Africans who were experiencing the full shock of European conquest and were beginning to search for an answer to the myth of African inferiority. A lot of Africans thought, well, I guess we just aren't as smart as the Europeans. We're not as strong. We're not as brave. We're not as capable as the Europeans. We must just be inferior. And this battle told Africans that that wasn't the case. On the negative side, there's also a consequence of this battle, the Italian desire to avenge this humiliating loss. And as a result, We'll see the rise of militarism, meaning the desire to like build up your army to be better and better and better, and ultimately fascism in Italy. That's something that's going to happen in Germany also in the 1930s. It's going to be something that's going to happen in Italy. And those Italian dictators are going to point to this loss and say, never again will we be humiliated. Never again will we lose. We have to build up our army. We might think about becoming friends with people like Adolf Hitler, who also have a desire to rule and reign in a modern European